I will speak for about 35 minutes, but before I begin, let me invite each of us to think for a second or two of the names of one or two living people that we would consider to be leaders. Please think of the names of one or two such people. And I wonder why you think of this name. So think as well of the qualities or attributes that you associate with being a good leader. Well, who are our leaders? I'm sure you're thinking of very interesting names right now. I wonder who is thinking of their own name. I guess no one. We live in a culture that teaches us to be modest people, and modesty is a beautiful virtue. But when it comes to leadership, I want to suggest that your modesty may be misplaced or mistaken because of a broken stereotype of leadership. We tend to associate leadership only with those in charge, like presidents, generals, chief executives, and the like. We think of leaders only as people who are famous, rich, or celebrities, often obsessed with their own status, the very opposite of humility. And so, of course, it would be immodest to call ourselves leaders in that respect. But the idea that leadership is only for chief executives is not the solutions to any problems in business, politics, or society. In fact, it's part of the problem. And I want to suggest that if we understand leadership correctly, we will find that leadership indeed is compatible with true humility and modesty, and that the very first people we should think about as leaders are ourselves. And I will explain why. And what do good leaders do to motivate those around them? That was part 2 of our mental experiment, and I know people came up with wonderful ideas like decisiveness and honor and courage. But I wonder who was thinking about this idea, articulated by someone with wonderful leadership credentials. He said this, quote, "You must love those you lead before you can be an effective leader." I just quoted General Eric Shinseki, who until a few years ago was Chief of Staff of the United States military, highest ranking military officer in the US. And when I first heard that quote, it struck me as strange, coming from a military class that we all associate with being tough. Or maybe not out of place. Because the more I thought about it, the more I suspect that generals are making better choices if they love the people they must place in harm's way. And I also suspect that soldiers are performing better if they believe they're valued in a very deep way by the people who have the horrible burden of sending them out possibly to face their death. So who is a leader? Well, we're all leading, well or poorly, all the time, and our claim to leadership is not our status in a school or organization, but simply the values that we choose to role model in our life and work. This idea that everyone is a leader certainly runs against stereotype. We don't think this way. But it's not a gimmick or something I have made up. If you look in the dictionary, you will find various definitions of leadership, but the definitions will always include this one: to point out a way, direction, or goal, and to influence others toward it. Isn't it true that everyone in this room is doing those words all the time? You're pointing out a way or a direction for your co-workers and associates by how you treat your colleagues, how hard you work, what you do with your money and time, whether you care only about yourself or about other people also. In all these cases, you're leading, pointing out a way, and having influence on others, good or bad. Many of you are parents. Could there be any more obvious example of pointing a way and influencing others than what parents do for children in a lifetime? Some of you are faculty and staff of this institution. Your role modeling will likely be the most extensive example that young adult students will see of how adult human beings ought to behave and interact in a workplace. Alberto Hurtado, a 20th century Chilean Jesuit, now considered a saint by the Catholic Church, once put it this way, quote, "In order to teach, it is enough to know something, but to educate, one must be someone. True education consists in giving oneself as a living model, an authentic lesson." End quote. To realize our full leadership potential, then, we all need to get more explicit, more purposeful about ourselves as leaders, about what kind of leaders we want to be, and about how we will project this in our families, workplaces, and the other arenas in which we interact. To that purpose, I now want to share some ideas about leadership drawn from research, personal experience, and some examples close at hand here in Jamshedpur. For 7 years, I was a Jesuit seminarian studying to be a priest. Then for 17 years after leaving the seminary, I worked at J.P. Morgan and Company, fortunate enough to serve as a managing director on 3 continents. And as it is my privilege to deliver the J.R.D. Tata lecture, I would also like to reflect my ideas through another prism, a third prism. That is the life and ideas of both the founder of this venerable group, Mr. Jamshedpur Tata, and of Mr. J.R.D. Tata. And so, my friends, even if you find my thoughts of no particular value, I can assure you that you will have participated in something that is probably unprecedented, because I believe this is the first time in history that the names of Ignatius of Loyola, J.P. Morgan, and Jamshedpur Tata all appeared in the same sentence. And why not? These 3 individuals long ago formed venerable organizations that still exist and operate in dozens of countries. The Tata Group currently has presence in more than 80 countries. Jesuits work in more than 100 countries. But to be fair to the Tata Group, the Jesuits have had a 300-year head start. To be sure, the mission of a religious order differs from that of an investment bank or from a diversified industrial conglomerate, and of course there are differences in business culture between the US and India, but it's my conviction after working in 3 continents in both bottom-line oriented financial institutions and charitable institutions that great leadership is great leadership in every context. Management tactics may differ completely from one context to another, but there are some universal qualities of great leadership. And perhaps controversially, I want to claim that some of those universal qualities are deeply spiritual. We see the outcomes of great leadership, but we cannot count or touch many of the qualities of great leadership, and we do not value them on a balance sheet the way we value this building. And I want to talk about three such principles. First, great leadership is focused on purpose greater than self. It is heroic. Second, great leaders are self-aware. They know their strengths, weaknesses, values, and outlook on the world. And third, great leaders love those they lead. That is, they recognize each person as uniquely dignified, and they try to unlock the potential of their subordinates and colleagues. So first let me start with leadership, and before I do, let's just take a New York slang test. If I'm speaking too quickly or in too much New York slang, just wave your hands. Okay, so either everyone is asleep or you can understand. So let's begin with heroism. I previously mentioned three remarkable individuals who changed history in some notable way, and we've grown accustomed to associating heroism with extraordinary people and extraordinary acts, like saving persons trapped in burning buildings or saving comrades on battlefields. But most of us will never have the chance to save someone in distress. Indeed, most of us cannot control the opportunities that life ultimately presents us. Ignatius of Loyola aspired to be a soldier until battle injury forced him to consider a new path in life. And Mr. J.R.D. Tata's aspirations, first to a military career and later to an engineering degree, both had to yield to his father's yieldings in other directions. What these two controlled was not their life opportunities, but rather what we always control, how we think, react, and behave in the face of whatever opportunities our life does present. We're gathered at a higher learning institution. Teachers and staff here have no guarantee of making a profound, life-altering impact in a student's life. Teachers' heroism becomes manifest in their commitment to live and work every day as if they might make this kind of impact. And let's be frank, for many of us, the opportunities life presents will be small, and our heroism will not be won in some spectacular moment that everybody watches on television. Rather, it will be the fruit of a lifetime of dedicated, conscientious effort, like that of teachers, parents, quality inspection officers in factories and on building sites, nurses, accountants, and in countless other professions. Above all, heroes devote themselves to purpose greater than self. There's an anecdote, perhaps apocryphal, about the US President John Kennedy in the early 1960s, who visited the space agency during the era when the US and the Soviet Union were racing to get a rocket to the moon first. And as the story goes, the president, during his tour of the space agency, at one point met a janitor who was cleaning up an office, and I guess to be polite, engaged him in conversation and asked, "What's your job here?" And the janitor supposedly replied, "Mr. President, I'm putting a man on the moon." Even if this anecdote sounds too overly romantic to us, everyone here knows that its point is sound. The teams that perform best are teams where people, if I can teach you some American slang, teams where people get over themselves and appreciate that the organization does not revolve around them and their ambitions for their own life. Rather, whether the Jesuits, J.P. Morgan, XLRI, the Tata Group, or the Indian cricket team, great organizations only succeed when individuals see themselves as participating in a mission greater than themselves and willingly invest some of their energy, talent, intellect, creativity, and ego in purpose greater than self. This sounds like a spiritual idea, and of course it is. Every one of the world's great spiritual traditions champions the notion that we are here on earth to transcend ourselves. But it is also a business idea. Listen to Alan Mulally, the head of Ford Motor Company, a materially oriented industry if ever there was one, as he describes his role as president of an automobile company in consummately spiritual terms. Quote, "What I was really being asked to do was to help connect a set of talented people to a bigger goal. And so, the higher the calling, the higher the compelling vision you can articulate, the more it pulls everybody in," end quote. Or, listen to an example closer to home as Mr. Jamshedpur explains his own philosophy of business. "We consider the interests of the shareholders as our own, and the health and welfare of the employees as the sure foundation of our success. In a free enterprise, the community is not just another stakeholder in business, but is in fact the very purpose of its existence." I talk about this principle of heroism not because it sounds nice, but because it goes to one of the great crises in the world of business today, the struggle between self-interest and purpose greater than self. Some of you may be aware of the fascinating study conducted every year by the U.S. University, UCLA, which annually interviews 18-year-old young people across the U.S. who are entering university. As students rank their values, more than 70% of them now say it is very important to them to become rich. And only 30% or so of them say it is important to develop a philosophy of a meaningful life. Those proportions have exactly reversed over the last 4 decades. So we raise students in a culture that celebrates conspicuous consumption. We recruit them into industries like my former business, investment banking, that offers very lucrative pay packages. And we face real challenges then in nurturing purpose greater than self players in a put yourself first world. Of course, in business, we need individuals who are ambitious and motivated to succeed in ways that result in superb performance, innovation, and that inspires peers to raise their own performance levels. Without this element of self-interest, companies cannot thrive. But at the very same moment, we need these same individuals to keep self-interest in proportion. We need individuals who are willing to struggle and fight for purpose greater than self in family, company, nation, and community. But getting this attitude is a self-awareness task. It calls on us to become aware of our deepest beliefs. So let me now talk about the importance of self-awareness, the second idea. Every Jesuit in history, from the 16th century European founders to some 4,000 21st century Jesuits now working here in India, has participated during training in a month-long intense period of personal reflection called the spiritual exercises, during which a Jesuit is removed completely from the workplace, from reading newspapers, watching television, from anything that could deter from the intense introspection that becomes the Jesuits' only job responsibility for 30 days. These guided meditations were St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, very practical attempt to translate into a systematic approach the fruits of his own journey to religious and overall self-understanding. As far as Jesuits are concerned, this is, of course, a religious experience, but the self-assessment that is taking place in them makes them a wonderful leadership training ground, because each of these guys is being forced to ponder, who am I? Why am I here? What is worth doing in a human lifetime? Anyone who has managed lots of people or worked in a human resources department, I did both at Morgan, has been mystified by the phenomenon of rising young stars who all of a sudden crash and burn, even though they seemed to have the total package of smarts, skills, and ambition. One school of thought attributes these spectacular flameouts to lack of self-awareness. That is, they do very well when asked only to do straightforward tasks, like moving numbers around Excel spreadsheets. But they fail when we began to ask them to deal with ambiguous business problems that had no clear solutions, or to motivate and manage people through change and uncertainty. And most business problems have no easy solutions. Indeed, many strategic challenges have no solutions at all. And so we need individuals who have the good judgment to evaluate various subpar alternatives and identify the best. And then who have courage, the courage to move forward without the mathematical certainty that their proposed strategy will succeed. And this lack of judgment and courage sometimes befalls very smart people who learn how to do school, but who never learn how to do life. Because school comes easily to them, they never face serious challenge, setbacks, failure. They therefore never develop learning agility, to be agile, the ability to confront one's weaknesses, learn from one's mistakes, fail and persevere, and accept feedback from others. The longtime Harvard professor Abraham Zelznick once noted how many successful executives were, in his words, twice born. He wasn't referring to religious conversion. Rather, he observed that personal crisis like injury, alcoholism, or bankruptcy had buffeted these individuals early in adulthood and forced them to reevaluate their lives and come to grips with who they were and what they stood for and what they wanted. And his thesis, that the strength of character born of adversity explained their long-term success by tiding them through life's subsequent challenges. We might here recall Ignatius of Loyola's severe battle injury, shattering his life plans, leading to a profound conversion and self-reinvention. Or we might also think of a young Jamshedpur watching his father's banking firm collapse, seeing his own future career dissipate with it, soon after embarking on his first journey outside India to England, to be besieged there by his father's creditors, and in the course of this jarring journey, beginning to perceive his way forward in the world as an industrialist. Perhaps this difficult moment fostered in him the strong convictions and sense of purpose that we so admire in his legacy. If we are to lead our own lives, not to mention to lead others, we need to make fundamental investments in knowing ourselves. Decades after the anecdote I just related, listen to J.R.D. Tata on his 21st birthday, writing to his father, and in a painfully honest way, underscoring that his own investment in self-awareness is not really taking root. Quote, "One more year has fallen on my shoulders. I have been looking back and also deep inside myself with the merciless eye of conscience, and have been trying to find out whether the last year I have gained any experience or wisdom. I haven't found out much yet." End quote. If a crisis does not thrust a moment of self-scrutiny upon us, we need to find or manufacture some process for ourselves for coming to grips with these fundamental issues of what we think human life ought to be about. And that is why, for example, a great business school like XLRI teaches not only technical skills like calculating present value or deciphering debits and credits, but also invites students to examine their own values, the morality of their actions, and the broader purposes of human endeavor. So we need to make a profound investment in knowing ourselves, and we also need day-to-day mechanisms for helping us to stay on track with how we're doing. And the Jesuit tradition teaches a wonderful little process that anybody here could begin doing tomorrow in less than 10 minutes. For the rest of his life, after his month-long investment in self-awareness, the Jesuit founder advises that each day we ought to take 2 little mental breaks. Let's say 5 minutes after lunch, 5 minutes at the end of the day. First, remind yourself, why are you grateful as a human person? Second, call to mind some important objective or personal weakness you need to work on these weeks. And third, mentally revisit the last few hours and try to take away some little lesson that might help in the next few hours. If you were distracted all morning, why? If you have not treated a colleague with sufficient respect or care this morning, why? The genius of this 16th century practice becomes obvious when we consider the 21st century lives we are trying to lead. We're floating along all day on a river of emails, meetings, phone calls, text messages, distractions, music plugs in our ear without ever pulling back to take stock. I'm sure those of you who are managers have seen the fallout, as I have, from these chaotic lifestyles we're trying to lead. The person who comes to the end of the workday without ever coming to his or her number one priority. The person who has a meeting go badly at 8:30 in the morning and the whole rest of the day is distracted, draining away all productivity. These are self-awareness problems. And we need to remedy them through self-awareness tools like what I described. Let me now turn to the third leadership principle I wanted to introduce. The idea about which people in large companies are sometimes most skeptical. What place could love possibly have in a large company? First of all, I assure you, I did not wander the hallways of JP Morgan embracing my colleagues and telling them I love them. Nor am I suggesting that you begin doing this. But anyway, the founder of the Jesuits said that love ought to manifest itself in deeds, not in words. So what kind of deeds could show the impact of love in a workplace? How about this for starters? Surely, no chief executive who loved his or her employees would have recklessly gambled their livelihoods and pensions in order to enrich him or herself through fraud. Like these morons at Enron and plenty others in my country, and I'm afraid a few in your country as well. And surely, no politician or public servant who loved citizens would deprive them of the education, health care, or other human services to which they are entitled in order to make him or herself rich through corruption. These are legitimate examples. Every spiritual tradition teaches us that human beings have innate dignity, and dignified human beings are entitled to just treatment, not only if they can afford it, but simply because they are human beings. But these foregoing examples make the case in a negative fashion, and I also want to develop a more positive vision of what love could look like in a workplace. Listen to this idyllic vision for a factory zone, and I wonder if any of you will be able to guess its context. Quote, "Be sure to lay wide streets, planted with shady trees, every other of a quick-growing variety. Be sure there is plenty of space for lawns and gardens. Reserve large areas for football, hockey, and parks. Earmark areas for Hindu temples, Mohammedan mosques, and Christian churches," end quote. I hope at least a few of you could recognize this quote. It's Mr. Jamshedpur articulating his vision for what would become Jamshedpur. I trust you're familiar with his other labor market innovations, from shorter working hours, safe workplaces, and provident fund contributions for employees at a time when these were common neither in India nor in the West. Decades later, J.R.D. Tata, describing his own management philosophy, puts into words the belief system that may well have been at work in Jamshedpur's ideas. Quote, "You have to draw out the best in each person. At times it involves suppressing yourself. It is painful but necessary. To be a leader, you have got to lead human beings with affection." I worked in investment banking for some 17 years during the era when my industry began to embrace and promulgate the so-called agency theory of management, which posits that management's role as agent for shareholders is to focus on one consideration only: maximizing shareholder value. Managers are to make those investments which provide optimal financial returns and ruthlessly slash any expenses which do not. How might we assess Jamshedpur's vision through the prism of maximizing shareholder value? Surely some market analysts would tell us that space for lawns and gardens, not to mention for houses of worship, would be completely extraneous to a firm's value maximization mission. Allocation for provident funds, before this was proven necessary to attract talent, would likewise be seen as squandering the firm's resources. Well, shareholder maximization theories have, on the one hand, spurred admirable, laser-like focus on proper use of corporate resources. My spiritual tradition includes the parable of the good steward, the manager who understands that he has been entrusted with the earth's resources as a steward, to exercise wise and careful management rather than squander them thoughtlessly. Agency theory reminds a manager to be conscientious of his role as steward. But agency theory, used in shallow or simplistic ways, has sometimes run absolutely amok, leading to excessive preoccupation with short-term quarterly results only, neglect of the long-term good of the firm, and utter disregard for stakeholders beyond shareholders. Some market analysts would thus be appalled at Jamshedpur's attention to parks and a pleasant working environment as a wasteful preoccupation that adds no shareholder value. But I suspect Mr. Tata understood that he was not only treating his laborers in a dignified way, but at the same time he was making an investment that absolutely would have paid off in productivity over the long run. And let me use a few statistics from the US business environment to illustrate my point in contrast. In surveys of employees working in US companies, the majority are now unhappy in their work. 63% report high levels of stress. Half of employees say they worry frequently about losing their jobs. Only 40% say they trust their own senior manager. And the work week in these unhappy, mistrustful places is now 20% longer than it was one generation ago. Surely anyone could tell us that if this is the human condition in which we are asking employees to perform, they cannot possibly be flourishing to their maximum potential. Hence, I do not make the case for a loving work environment for soft reasons that will destroy shareholder value. Rather, I argue that we must create conditions in which each team member can flourish to his potential so that investors are richly rewarded. In fact, we ought to ponder the very notion of being a company, as is the Tata Group, JP Morgan, or believe it or not, the Jesuits. Jesuit is a sort of a nickname. When they founded their organization, they called themselves a company. In Spanish, La Compañía de Jesús, the company of Jesus. And the way they understood company was likely closer to the word's etymological roots than the ways we understand that word today, when its meaning has been almost completely hijacked by the connotation of commercial enterprise. The Latin roots of the word company are two words, the word cum, with or together, and the word panis, bread. So etymologically, your company, the word implies an almost familial sense. The group of people who break bread together, who give energy to and support one another, who are companions, a word which comes from exactly the same root. We're gathered at XLRI, one of India's leading management schools, whose graduates will inevitably make a powerful impact on India's business culture. And it is no surprise that XLRI, itself part of the Jesuit tradition, champions exactly the kind of ideas I have been speaking about. The school's mission includes this idea, quote, an abiding commitment to improving the quality of life in organizations and society. Every pundit I know of, whether they speak of business, political, or civic life, talks about the need for greater leadership. But though we all agree on the need, we've made very little progress. Indeed, in my country, the public is far more cynical and mistrustful of politicians and business leaders than we were one generation ago. We haven't made progress, we have gone backwards. In part because we're stuck with broken stereotypes. Stereotypes of leadership that have only to do with status, power, position in a hierarchical chart, money, or greed. Those in this room can teach society by the way we do business and the way we teach management, the way we treat our colleagues, and the way we raise our children. A very different, unique, principled, and workable model of leadership for the 21st century, based on the notion that everyone leads when role modeling values like those I've outlined. I asked at the outset of the talk that we each think of the names of one or two living leaders. And now, as I finish, I hope you will please think of your own name first. When I say we need competent, smart, and virtuous people who are willing to role model a new and better way of leading for those who are on our teams, in our families, in our companies, and our communities. Thank you so much for listening.
When I wrote Heroic Leadership, I spoke about 4 ideas. That people who are leading well, they're self-aware, they're ingenious, they're heroic, and they're loving. So self-aware means you have to know your own strengths and weaknesses, have your sense of values. Ingenious means the world is going to keep changing, and only people who can keep adapting to a new world are leading well. Heroic means that you don't just care about yourself. You care about something bigger than yourself also. And finally, loving, that people who are leading well, they see the potential of their subordinates, the people around them, and they try to develop that potential. And my idea was not that this is the only way of leadership, the exact way, the correct way. Rather, I just looked at the example of the early Jesuits, and of course XLRI is in the Jesuit tradition, and I tried to draw some of the cultural characteristics that helped the Jesuits succeed that could be relevant to anybody in any walk of life to do well as a leader. Whenever I talk about leadership, the first thing I say to people is that if we look at the dictionary, one of the definitions of leadership is to point out a way or a direction and to influence others. And when you think about those words, everybody really is leading. You know, parents, what they do for their children over a lifetime is point out some way of living, and they have influence. So parents are good leaders, teachers, and so yes, to me, absolutely, this kind of leadership can be taught, because the first thing we're asking people is, one, to accept the fact that they have a leadership opportunity and responsibility now. Not just when they become president of a company, just right now, even as a student, as a parent, as a teacher. And then the next step is to begin to reflect on what values, what kind of way are you willing to role model in your life. And so in that respect, each of us can be a better leader than we are right now and can improve our leadership style and approach.